Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. Around the 3rd to 4th week of April of 2023, we are kind of getting towards the, I don't want to say the end of summer because it is still blasted hot everywhere, but it feels like we're starting to see a few days, a few nights, a few mornings that are starting to break in terms of the weather. Like I mentioned last week, we're starting to get back into the kids going back to school. Football is starting in various places around the world, or at least here in the States. But another Sunday perspective, glad to be with all of you. I had a chance this week to be a co-host, sort of a last minute ad on the Software Defined Talk podcast. So we've had Brandon and Matt Ray. We've never had Cote on the show. We'll have to get that resolved. But I had a chance to co-host with them this week on a podcast. And one of the topics that we had was there was a recent interview on the Verge podcast with AWS CEO Adam Selipsky. And it was one of the things we discussed on the show this week, as well as some of the licensing changes that were happening with HashiCorp. And I know I talked about some of the licensing stuff last week on the Sunday Perspective show. And as we were doing the Software Defined Talk podcast, we sort of dove into it. We spent probably the last 20 minutes or so of the podcast. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's a good listen. It's a good kind of rundown of that interview. Adam went into a lot of different things. But, as I was finishing the podcast and sort of thinking about it for the last couple of days, it really kind of got me thinking about what does the future of AWS potentially look like? And here's the sort of the context of what I was thinking about. So a couple of things. One, in the interview, Adam, so famously we've talked on this show and in other shows, we've talked about, the kind of the phrase of like, how far into the evolution of cloud are we today? And different companies have different perspectives. AWS famously loves to say that we're still in the first inning, or we're 3 steps into a 10,000, 10K race. This was the first time I've sort of seen AWS say something that was a little more further along. They said, we're maybe 10 to 15% into that. And we've said on the show for a long time that, it's in their best interest to always say that we are earlier in the game because because AWS is so important to Amazon. The earlier we appear to be in the game and that they're growing, the bigger the multiple look like of how big the potential total addressable market is, or TAM is. Now, so that was sort of interesting. It was sort of the first time I'd hear him say, he thought we were like 10 or 15% into kind of the adoption of cloud as a whole. And so it got me thinking, if we're 10 or 15% in, and we use the normal kind of, crossing the chasm, famous book, Crossing the Chasm model of where we are, that would sort of say that we're getting closer to that stage where cloud is crossing the chasm. And AWS being the leader in that, I thought, well, what does crossing the chasm for cloud computing for AWS potentially look like? Because, if they are where they are, and we'll dive into this as we move along, but maybe it's worth looking at because not every company looks exactly the same pre-crossing the chasm in terms of the maturity of their business, the longevity of their business, and post-crossing the chasm. It's a different set of customers, it's a different set of market dynamics, it's a different total addressable market and all those sort of things. And then the other thing that I was reading about, and I'll put a link in the show notes, was an interesting article from a guy named Benedict Evans, who is a venture capitalist at A16Z, very well recognized, especially for kind of being a very big thinker about kind of global trends and global uses of technology, both on the consumer side and the business side. And he had a really interesting article that was talking about, what it was framed around, well, what will come next after Zoom? And so the idea was, Zoom, got started a while ago and was kind of around, but once the pandemic came along, it sort of took over the video conferencing market because obviously the dynamics of what was going on with everybody working from home forced everybody to be using video conferencing. And for whatever reason, lots of people point to maybe quality of their technology or simplicity of their technology or whatever it was. Zoom just became a rocket ship and kind of became the sort of de facto for a lot of people. Obviously, there's lots of other things that are still being used, Teams and Google Chat and WebEx and other things. But, Zoom sort of, rocketed up. And the whole framing in the article was really about, why did that happen for Zoom? And are the dynamics around things like what seems like sort of a commodity capability, why do some companies break away from that and others don't? And what I want to kind of do after the break is combine the sort of two things of what does AWS potentially look like after crossing the chasm, whenever that might be, and are the dynamics at play around sort of the what does the next look like, and will those impact kind of what's going on with the hyperscalers in this market or kind of the overall usage of cloud. So I want to get to that after the break.
This episode is supported by the AWS Insiders podcast. AWS Insiders is a fast-paced, entertaining, and insightful look behind the scenes of AWS and cloud computing. I'm a subscriber to AWS Insiders, and I love Rahul and Hillary's practical analysis and interviews. As an F1 racing fan, the recent episode on how AWS and F1 partnered together to make the races more exciting was especially entertaining. Search for AWS Insiders in your podcast player. We'll also include a link in the show notes. My thanks to AWS Insiders for their support.
Today's episode of the Cloudcast is sponsored by Datadog, a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, traces, and logs into one tightly integrated platform. Datadog APM empowers developer teams to identify anomalies, resolve issues, and improve application performance. Begin collecting stack traces, visualizing them as flame graphs, organizing them into profile types such as CPU, I/O, and more. Teams can search for specific profiles, correlate them with distributed traces, and identify slow or underperforming code for analysis and optimization. Plus, with Datadog APM Live Search, you can perform searches across the full stream of ingested traces generated by your application over the last 15 minutes. Try Datadog APM free with a 14-day trial, and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/APM-Cloudcast to get started. That's datadog.com/APM-Cloudcast. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, really kind of want to combine two thoughts. And again, want to combine looking at where AWS is today. Obviously, they are in a very, very strong position, both in terms of having defined what cloud computing really looks like, kind of the broad market usage and adoption of cloud computing, at least at the sort of hyperscaler level. Obviously, they've been a part of a number of very, very popular and incredibly important applications being built on top of AWS and lots of other things. But want to look at it in the lens of kind of this interview that Adam Selipsky did that I had a chance to talk about with the Software Defined Talk folks earlier this week. But really look at it in the context of, if AWS in their own, or in their own words, is getting close to, helping or getting to a point where their business in the context of cloud computing is sort of close to getting ready to cross the chasm. So move into the next phase of market adoption, market maturity, all those sort of things. And I'll put a link to Crossing the Chasm if you're not familiar with that concept or that book. And I want to combine that a little bit with some market dynamics around things that Adam Selipsky talked about in this interview. I thought it was a very sort of interesting interview. Brandon and I spent a lot of time sort of digging into what, maybe kind of looking between the lines, trying to read between the lines of what he was saying. And I also want to kind of look at it in the context of this other interesting article that I saw again from Benedict Evans from A16Z. So let's sort of start with some basic things. So from a business perspective, again, Amazon is sort of saying, look, we've been in business for 17 years. We're about an $85 billion a year company. We're growing at, the growth rates have slowed down some, but they're still growing at a fairly healthy rate. This last quarter, they still grew, a little north of 10%, say 12%. Just to put that in perspective, we went back to Q4 of 2021. I mean, their growth rates were up near 40% quarter over quarter, year over year. They're now down in the teens, so they've had a significant drop off just in terms of quarter over quarter. Still growing a lot. Their total numbers are still growing. But anyway, but been in this business, 17 years, about an $85 billion market. So the number that we always throw around with IT is somewhere between a $2.5 and a $3 trillion a year overall IT spend. And maybe it's a little bit larger than that. Folks like Gartner and IDC keep track of those numbers. So AWS as a whole, sort of the 800-pound gorilla in terms of hyperscaler infrastructure clouds, but still a small percentage of the overall IT spend, which includes both hardware, software, and services, right? So it's not just delivering compute, storage, networking, databases, all those sort of things. It's also the amount of money people spend for consulting services and consultants and outsourcing and all that other kind of stuff. So, I sort of think about this in terms of, what does AWS have today in terms of moats? What are the things that give them distinct advantages in the market, distinct scale in the market, sort of competitive moats, if you will. And then what are the things that, as we look at both this interview, which was very much around sort of where is AWS today, where are they going in the future, what is their AI strategy, and so forth. What are some of the things that may potentially become issues for them in the future, such that they may not necessarily look like the AWS that we've sort of come accustomed to as being very dominant over the last, say, 10 plus years. So as I looked at that, Amazon and / AWS have always made very, very large capital investments, CapEx type of investments. So, there's a analyst out there or a consultant out there who kind of tracks this stuff, kind of Charles Fitzgerald. We've talked about him on the show before. So Amazon as a whole has always been one to invest ahead of, especially in the CapEx space, ahead of growth, ahead of being in the market. So investments into data centers, into servers, into, those types of things. And you can kind of track, their investments and where that looks like. Now, keep in mind, those types of investments over the last 10 years or so were made and able to be made at very, very low interest rates. Amazon tends to keep a large amount of cash on hand, but so too does Microsoft, so too does Google, so too does Apple and others that compete against them. But they've always been very forward-looking in terms of making CapEx investments and understanding the scale of investments that have to be made. So that's been a moat that they've made for a long time. They claimed in this last interview that they probably have the largest farms of GPUs. And I don't remember exactly if they said they have like 50% of the world's GPUs, but they have a very, very large amount of GPUs relative to any other hyperscaler out there in the marketplace. There's also an article this week in the Register sort of saying they have probably the largest number of ARM servers as well. So they've made huge investments around the infrastructure of where the future of compute is going, both in terms of ARM chipsets as well as GPU chipsets. So again, another deep moat that they have in terms of scale, investments, being able to build some number of their own chips, not just being entirely reliant on NVIDIA or Intel or any other chip manufacturer. They've been making investments in that space. So that's an area where they have a level of moat, probably more so than anybody except for Google in that space. Now, as we start to look at kind of how the dynamics are changing, as we talked about, and we talked about it in another podcast, I talked about it last week. Amazon has been coming out with lots of capabilities lately, but they've also been sort of bumping up against, a lot of, capabilities that are open source, right? They're launching services that are based on open source, whether it's a Kubernetes or MongoDB or Elasticsearch or, Kafka or whatever it might be. And we're starting to see some of those open source projects or the companies that are dominant in those spaces starting to push back, right? We're starting to see some, we've lots of talk this last few months about, licensing changes around that. So the sort of easy, low-hanging fruit of pure open source may become more difficult for Amazon to just kind of go and spin up a service and, brand it themselves or brand it as, hey, all that community should come over to us. So, that may become a more challenging thing in which they can't just sort of take from open source communities. They'll either have to be more active participants in them and fork them and sort of run them themselves, or they may have to kind of get back to building some of their own technology. Now, you could argue, well, a lot of the infrastructure technology that exists today will be more than sufficient for the next 5, 6, 8, 10 years, and that may very well may be the case. But just something to kind of keep in mind. We talked about their growth rate's been slowing since Q4 of 2021. People can argue, well, their revenue has also been growing, and so when you're growing at 10 billion versus 80 billion, like your growth rates are going to slow. But still they have seen a decline over the last 6, 7, 8 quarters in terms of growth rates, and part of that's going to be customer usage. Part of that's going to be there's going to reach a point where as much as Andy or Adam Selipsky will like to say, well, in the fullness of time, all things will be in the cloud. We're starting to see people sort of say, well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe that won't necessarily come to fruition. And we will very much have, multiple clouds or on-premise applications for a long period of time, or, things along that way. So, those things are all sort of going on. Now, as I think about the things that could potentially sort of change, big dynamics that can change, we talked a lot in that software-defined talk interview about a concern that Brandon and I sort of were hearing in the interview with Adam Selipsky about what felt a little bit like a lack of innovation. Not no innovation, but sort of this, all innovation is coming because we're listening to our customers. And that's the type of thing that you hear. And again, we may be taking that completely out of context and just sort of listening to phrasing and so forth. But, as companies become bigger and their installed base revenue stream continues to become more and more important to the company. And this isn't just an Amazon AWS thing, although AWS has become increasingly more important as a profit driver for Amazon. But we see it in every large technology company, whether it's an Oracle or a Cisco or a VMware or a Red Hat or, name it, larger company, IBM, in which, you expect sort of steady state, your sort of cash cow businesses to always be there. And, while you want to be innovative, there's only so many resources you can apply to innovative versus I still have to continue to apply resources to, steady state things. And those things happen over time. And this is why I brought up the sort of like, reiterating their claim of like, hey, we've been in business for 17 years. It may not seem like that long, but, they've been in business for 16, 17 years. And they're only at 10 to 15% sort of, adoption of what, could be moving into the cloud. So, kind of brings into question, will the next 10 years look the same as these years? Now, there's a couple other things that sort of jump out at me as I think about AWS. And I don't mean to imply that like AWS isn't innovative anymore. I mean, they're still doing a lot of really, really interesting things. Obviously, you go to reInvent every year. There's, a laundry list of new features. We do a show about that every year. But if I think about it, there's a couple of things that kind of, make you pause a little bit. Because if you think about the dynamics of any company that's grown in size and it's grown in maturity, there's certain things that they do, right? One of them is you start to look at, how much of what they're doing is innovation, right? You start looking at how much of what they do is shifting from their core original kind of purpose, right? So, for example, if you look at, you look at somebody like VMware, right? VMware continued to be very, very good at infrastructure, software, virtualization. They were able to get into some adjacencies like networking and like storage, but those things never necessarily became as big as the core virtualization. You look at a company like Cisco, still does a ton of work in kind of core networking, switching and routing and so forth, and has had adjacencies in security, has adjacencies in communication, those types of things. But again, sort of adjacent sized businesses, not necessarily like even bigger than the original business. And, you could argue the same thing with, like an Oracle, right? A database business is still very large. And what ends up happening is you don't tend to necessarily internally innovate those things, you tend to be able to move into other markets because of acquisitions, right? Cisco's famous for acquisitions. VMware has done a ton of acquisitions. Oracle has done a bunch of acquisitions. Nearly every single, company that has been able to grow at that size. And when I think about, and Aaron and I have talked about this a number of times on the show, like the cloud providers, at least AWS in particular, Google to a certain extent, Microsoft not as much. Microsoft has had a very robust acquisition strategy. It's not as obvious how they're going to do acquisitions or that they've done acquisitions or that's part of their DNA. And that becomes part of the, well, okay, are you going to organically be able to grow at the rates that you need to? Because what tends to happen is when companies get that big, they have to look at ideas in terms of, is this $1 billion idea? Is this a $5 billion idea? Because if it's not, it's almost more distracting than it is worth trying to move the ship, trying to turn the ship, trying to take on the ship. So the sort of lack of sort of a acquisition culture or a machine to do acquisitions or partnerships may end up becoming something that, AWS has been able to avoid for a long time because their internal culture has created so much innovation. But if you need things that are bigger, and not having done that as much, that may be something that, it potentially hinders their ability to really, grow to, get past the chasm. The second thing that jumped out at me is, you oftentimes sort of go, okay, what's their portfolio of things that are of greater value? And in the tech stack, in the tech world, while infrastructure, if you are the dominant sort of infrastructure player, which they are very much, can be very, very profitable, which today it is for Amazon. Applications oftentimes as those underlying layers commoditize, you have to sort of be able to move up the stack or move into adjacencies. And while you could argue that Amazon has, a tremendous portfolio of what feels to a certain extent like sort of everything, I think a lot of people would sort of argue that a lot of their portfolio isn't necessarily differentiated. It's there. Yes. Do they have 10 database services? Yep. Do they have, 17 ways to do containers? Yep. Do they have, 87,000 different, compute instances? Yep. But, are they truly differentiated? And this is where, you start to get into some things like, so take, for example, you can make the argument, or people have made the argument, at least in the early innings type of analogy, that maybe AWS is behind in AI. And, that's debatable, right? You can listen to the interview with Andy or Adam. He would argue that they're in great shape. You can talk to other people and people would sort of argue, well, maybe they're behind. They don't seem to own as many of their own models, or, they're doing more stuff in partnerships, and whether that's good or bad, to be determined. But, you look at something like, what Microsoft's doing with OpenAI, where they have essentially said, we were probably behind in what we were doing, and putting the resources into that may not be the most effective way for them to catch up if they're trying to catch up to like Google, for example, in search. And so you have a new innovative partner that's come in, an ecosystem partner that's come in, and you've prioritized them, ahead of maybe other investments you might make. And it'll be very interesting to see if AWS is able to, or the market is able to not only grow more companies like an OpenAI in terms of really creating a differentiated experience of, anything. In their case, how do you interact with AI, or how do you interact with data? How do you interact with those types of things? So, I think those are going to be very, very interesting. So between, is the pace of innovation still there? Is the partnership and sort of acquisition type of thing still there? And is the application portfolio there? Because you could sort of argue that maybe it's not necessarily, where it could be if you're trying to get to 40%, 50% market share. And so I do sort of wonder sometimes if, looking at those things holistically, if the future of AWS really eventually just sort of settles into, they are able to build a very, very large moat of being the largest infrastructure company, the most CapEx invested infrastructure company. They're able to continue to innovate and drive profitability at that layer. And, does that give them, deep moats? Does that allow them to drive pricing down, or drive competitive pricing? Or do we start to see the innovative companies, the OpenAIs of the world, the next 50 or 60, companies that maybe aren't all AI related, but fall in that category of like Benedict Evans is talking about in terms of, the thing after Zoom or the thing after, whatever, the next sort of major jump in some category. Are they going to go to AWS or are they going to go to somebody else, as well, they give me more flexibility. They're more interested in helping to drive our success. And I think all of those things collectively, does it mean that AWS is in trouble? Does it mean, we're not, AWS isn't going to be around in 5 years or 10 years? No, absolutely not. I think the moats they've built around infrastructure very much, ensure that they'll be around for quite a while. But I think we're starting to see, the game changing enough, and some of the milestones that, have already been accomplished in their first 17 years that are, sort of in the past, are going to be different, right? They're not just competing against, legacy IT processes. They're not just competing against, can I do things on demand? They're not just competing against, developers or builders not liking their internal IT group. They're now competing against other groups that are, other companies that are as well funded. Google's now profitable in GCP. Azure, for the faults and flaws that they have, is still highly funded. Microsoft is still doing extremely well. I think the dynamics of a lot of things are going to be very, very different. And not only that, you have new leadership. Andy Jassy's not around anymore. Adam Slipsky's around. You've seen some people leave, and that happens with every company. But I think it's going to be really interesting to watch the next, say, 5 years or so in terms of if they actually cross the chasm, if their numbers are what they say they are, and their analysis of the market and where they are. It feels like the dynamics that are in front of them, the things to get across the chasm, are going to be very different than they've been over the last 15 years, 10 years, 7 years, whatever it might be. And it'll be very interesting to see how they adapt. Are they comfortable in the model they have? Can you continue to be the most innovative company if your strategy is, well, we're just going to listen to customers really hard? Customers are great. The early adopter customers are great at telling you where they want to go. The mid adopter customers aren't so much. They just want you to take care of things for you. So does their culture adapt to being, sort of mid customer? I think those things are all interesting questions. I'm not making a judgment one way or the other that they won't be as successful. I'm not sort of making a prediction. I just think that interview and then thinking about Benedict Evans' article about, what does the next thing look like, kind of got me thinking of, are they as well prepared to cross the chasm as they, have been at innovating in creating the cloud? And will the dynamics of creating the cloud, the early adopters of the cloud, the sort of, pre-chasm game plan, does that look, does the playing field, if you will, does the board look the same once you've crossed the chasm? Or do very different dynamics come into play? Because we've seen, if history is any indicator of, what large companies look like and how they prioritize and how they grow and the sort of muscles they have to be successful, they are different than smaller kind of growing companies. And so it will be interesting to see if any of those things that we've seen historically with other companies have to apply to AWS, and to the areas where they look like maybe that hasn't been a priority for them, or they don't necessarily have those muscles today, do they evolve and have them in the future? So all interesting stuff to take a look at. A little tough to predict if that's going to happen. I think this is probably a 4 or 5 year thing we're going to have to look at, but definitely something we'll look at in the mid-year shows and other things. So anyways, with that, I've been going for a while. I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. Thanks for telling a friend. We can't do this show without you guys continuing to help us. Just listen and be part of the community. Give us feedback. Tell a friend. Help us keep growing the show. We appreciate all that. We appreciate every single one of you. So with that, I'll wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.